as you've been talking to people, because you have this huge community to draw on and you've talked to so many people about their careers, like, is there any sort of consistent takeaway that you've gotten from all these conversations, whether it's, younger people, older people, like what are the typical things that you're sort of seeing as the thing that everyone is going through, no matter where you're at in your life and your career?
I'd say everyone is a transitioner, a career transitioner. We tried to figure out like what is the thread that connects all these diverse people across industries, job functions, generations, geographic locations. And I would say everyone is that career transitioner who's thinking about the next move, whether they're 25 or 65. We're all sort of like, work is just part of life now. It's not so segmented. And the other piece is everyone is a lifelong learner. And I think that's super important because that's more obvious for our younger members. But when you look at people over 50, I've kind of seen two, a fork in the road with two paths. There are some people who actually find a lot of success, especially on a financial level. And they feel like, oh, I've got this job. I'm pretty senior and I'm an expert in something. So I'm done. I'm just going to like coast. I will sit here. I'll keep making my salary, or maybe they're self-employed, but they're kind of like happy just with the status quo. And then you have people who realize that even if they're in that kind of cushy position, that they've always got to keep learning, and that learning can come from all different kinds of sources. So I have this funny example from my last job, my last full-time job, where I was kind of doing some interviews to figure out like, what is it like in a kind of corporate structure when people work together across ages? And I also was just trying to get, advice. What do you think CIRKEL should look like? What should it be? And I spoke to these two guys, one of them in his, I'd say late 50s and one of them in his late 20s, and they work together. And I'm not sure which one I started with. Maybe it was, let's say the older guy. He was saying, oh, like things are good. Like I'm happy. I love my job. I make some good money. I love working with, let's call him James. James is great. And I think we have a good kind of intergenerational working relationship. And then I interviewed James, who was like, let's call the older gentleman,
Jerry.
Michael. He was like, oh, Jerry. I'm actually watching Seinfeld. So yeah, Jerry. He was like, I try to get my work done and I'm really trying to like learn a lot about the business, but Jerry will interrupt me a lot to ask me about Excel or Slack or some tech piece. And it's actually really distracting because I really can't get as much work done. And it's so funny to me that like when I was speaking to the older person, he said everything was fine and he's done learning and there's nothing for him to actually learn from younger people. He's just there to teach others. And then clearly like there is a very specific need for that older Jerry guy to be learning, but it's that growth mindset that he's missing out on. So I think those are the two kind of consistencies, the career transitions, which are just normal now, and the lifelong learning, which really has to be there if you're going to move through those career transitions.
Yeah. And that's actually one of the things I really appreciate growing up with a father who was a consultant and a business owner, because he was always like learning the new tech. Like I remember we had, a video camera on our old like white IBM computer. And we were playing around with that when I was like 10. It was just like no one else had video cameras on their computers. It was just like completely foreign concept at the time. And like that, I think that there's this, maybe that's one of the biggest sort of friction points between generations, is that sort of technological break. And it's kind of interesting because, as I'm getting into my 30s, I'm starting to feel it. It's like, I tried to do TikTok and I just ended up watching it for 5 hours. And I was like, I got to get off this thing. And like, I was like, I was supposed to make a TikTok, not watch a bunch of TikToks. And like, and I just like, I coach people who are incredibly worried about ageism all the time. And I try to be as productive with that coaching as I can be, because it can easily go into like just complaining about the world the same way, like, millennials were my generation was very complaining about like boomer generations and things like that. But at the end of the day, like, in my mind, it's like, well, why do people have these perceptions? And how do you preempt that assumption so that you can almost like negate it from ever happening, right? So if you know someone's going to think something about you, what can you interject in a conversation about Slack or about, your way of working with technology that eliminates that concern in the job hunt specifically? And it's kind of, unfortunate in some situations where I had one client who wanted to work in marketing communications. And, our first coaching call, I spent the entire hour just trying to show them how to use Zoom. And
Mm,
I was like, if you want to work in marketing communications, like, Zoom is the least of the things you need to understand. And so
yeah.
it's kind of like, I feel like there's like younger folks who have these like, I want to be a CEO and a director tomorrow. And it's like, maybe there's some things you have to learn before you get there, right? And then when I speak with older folks, they're like, well, I don't understand why no one's hiring me. And I'm like, well, there's maybe some technological gaps that need to be filled here. And I'm kind of curious, have you, with the example you gave, I think that that's like a perfect example, but are there any other things that people can do throughout their lives, like whether you're young or you're old, to just keep that, if we're all lifelong learners, what are the core things that we should learn and keep learning?
I think it's all about curiosity. There's this man, Chip Connolly, who's a big speaker in the intergenerational work conversation. And he has a term that he calls a mentern, which is really for someone maybe over 40 or 50 who sees themselves as much as wise as he or she is curious. And I think it's that balance of like understanding that you have a lot to offer and being generous with your knowledge, but also understanding that you'll never know everything and to stay curious and ask questions. That's what really kills me the most. Like sometimes we'll see someone sign up for CIRKEL because they're curious and they assume it's a traditional mentoring platform. And then they're like repulsed almost that they have to pay for this service because they just think that they're there to give. And it really hurts me because I'm like, I don't know if I really am in the place to teach you something now, because clearly you're closing yourself off to learning. You just think you're here to teach, but I think you're seeing things the wrong way. I think if you go through life assuming that you're done learning and you're gonna, everything that you should ever know, it's really gonna hurt you somehow. Maybe in your wallet, maybe in your relationship, maybe in your career. But I think that's really problematic. And I think that'll change. So if you are curious, those kinds of questions about how do I use something, or even Googling, like, where can I learn how to use Zoom, and watching, a YouTube video is great. It can be as simple as that. And how many times have I Googled, how do I use Google Analytics, or, ads on Google, or all these things that felt really far outside my wheelhouse. And that validation, when you can literally watch a YouTube video and then do it, it's so rewarding. And I think there are little versions of that we can do every day, where we just we ask questions, we keep learning, we use Google. And if Google doesn't work because it doesn't answer every question, especially those life, those nuggets of wisdom about life, then come to CIRKEL and learn it from someone who's been there, done that. I think it's just looking for help and being open.
I love that. I love that so much. And it really plays into the idea of networking as well, because we're always encouraging people to network. And when I'm working with younger people, the concern is like, I guess the concern is the same for most generations, but it's like, I don't want to look stupid. I don't want to network and look stupid. I don't want to reach out to this person and not seem like I know what I'm talking about. And I would only assume that gets worse with age, right? You don't want to be in your 50s reaching out to someone who's maybe in their 30s and looking stupid, right? Or feeling like you're looking stupid. And so that is one of the biggest things that I try to encourage people to do, is to approach it from that curious mindset, because that is the only way. It's like, if you're curious, you won't look dumb, because you're just asking questions about what you're excited about. if you're like trying to sound impressive, that's when people tend to go wrong.
Yes,
Yeah. And so I love that you're
totally.
talking about this stuff because and you're relating it to like our entire lives, right? If you stop being curious in your relationship, if you stop being curious in your family, if you stop being curious with your friends, like you'll lose things over time. And then
Yeah.
you kind of see people isolate as they get older. We kind of become more tribal is what the articles all say. Do you see
Mhm.
any of that? Like, do you see people becoming more isolated as they get older or more tribalistic as they get older or anything like that?
Definitely. I think the pandemic has actually shown me firsthand what happens when you leave the office. Let's say, ageism is so prevalent. Over half of Americans over the age of 50 get pushed out of long-term jobs before they choose to retire. And around that same age, if you look at 50, maybe they're being pushed out of the office, so they lose their professional kind of daily connections that they make at the water cooler or, at the cubicles or whatever. But it's also a similar time to when, if you have kids, they might leave home and you have an empty nest and you sort of lose ties to their friends or their friends' parents and those school systems that maybe you were once part of. Um, and I think that's where those are like the impetuses that start to push us into these reclusive, disconnected lifestyles. And it really becomes like a downward spiral from there. So I think it's a reminder, especially as we've all experienced during the pandemic, that when we lose these networks that are kind of built into life and structure of your daily activities, you can feel lonely really fast. And I don't know what the statistics say about life, in 2021, but I know that before the pandemic, our youngest members of society and our oldest were the two most lonely groups. So there's definitely a loneliness issue, and it's really dangerous when we start to lose our natural networks. And if they happen, that's kind of like maybe you start working for yourself, like now I do, and I basically don't leave this apartment is what it feels like.
Hmm.
Then I need to make the extra effort and join networking groups online. I just signed up for Y Combinator's co-founder matching tool, which is just a great way to network with cool business owners. Yeah, there's so much available. You just, again, have that curiosity to seek it out and find those networks.